Well, good evening, and welcome to the last lecture of our season, presentation by Dr. Margaret Miles. We are so excited to have her. So I just want to remind you that you can still sign up for the member brunch at the Kalamazoo Country Club on the 21st. There's signups outside. That will be our last event of the season. We do have an exciting program. Can you not hear me? Can you hear me now? We do have an exciting program for next year as well. So it is time to renew your membership. So please do bring a friend, bring 3 friends. We are a great value and interesting organization, and we really welcome your participation. I want to thank the KIA and KIA staff for hosting us. Exciting things going on here. Check them out. Art Fair is already here again. Seems like time really flies. So with that, I want to turn over the microphone to Dr. Lynn Miles, who is going to give the introduction to Dr. Margaret Miles.
Hi. Testing. Oh, forgot something.
I am definitely falling down on my job. So we do have an election. Let me. So I'm sorry. Yep. I'm done.
All right. Some days are better than others. Okay, so I'm Diane Everts, and I'm vice president right now of the Art League and in charge of nominations. And so we have 3 new board members to present to you tonight. And I think I saw Kim. Are you here? Kim Davison over there. And you've read the bios, so I thought I would just mention the names. And Ann Van Giesen. There she is. Okay. And, oh, Pam, where are you? There's Pam Boudreau. Okay, good. All right, so those are our 3 that we would like to present to you to become Art League board members. So can I have do you have any questions? Okay, hearing none. Is there a motion to approve?
I move that we approve the slate.
Okay, David moves that we approve the slate. Is there a second? All in favor say aye. Any other votes? Okay. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
I have to do what? Oh, I thought we did.
Okay. All right, so we also need to approve the returning board members that are coming back for either a new term or a continuation of their term. Do you want me to list all of those? Okay, so is there a motion to approve the members who are staying on or continuing their term? Okay, and second? All in favor, please? Aye. Opposed? Thank you, that motion carries. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, now I'll introduce you guys to Margie. Margie's my aunt. She was a child when I was born. I'm a child of the oldest sister. So Margaret M. Miles is an archaeologist and the Edward A. Dickson Emerita Professor of Art History at the University of California, Irvine. She served a 6-year term as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Classical Studies at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens from 2008 to 2014. And her publications include, I'll just name a couple of her books. One is The Temple of Nemesis at Rhamnous. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Margie? And another one is about the excavations of the Agora. And then another one, which is of particular interest tonight, is there's a whole book about this topic. It's called Art as Plunder, The Ancient Origins of Debate About Cultural Property. You'll hear the interesting things about that tonight, from Cambridge in 2008. And she's also done 3 edited volumes, one on Cleopatra, a Sphinx Revisited, another one called Autopsy in Athens, and then another one called Blackwell's Companion to Greek Architecture. So recently, she and her team also conducted field work on a Greek temple in the Elymeion, is that correct? Elymeion Sanctuary at Contrada Mango in Segesta, Sicily, for a new reconstruction of an early classical temple. So this accomplished scholar in a rigorous and competitive field is also, as you all will soon be hearing, this is now my voice, this is now not the lists of important things that she's done, this is the personal stuff. She is a riveting speaker. She's the best storyteller in our large, verbally gifted family. She is the daughter of an American historian father, a student of Willis Dunbar, there's a Kalamazoo connection here, and of a labor archivist mother, and she is, in her person and in her life, the realization of the very best intellectual heritage of both of her parents. I introduce to you my aunt, Dr. Margaret Miles.
Wow, I don't know if I can live up to that, but thank you so much, Lynn. That's really great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My parents, as Lynn was hinting, met at K College in 1939 in freshman English. Actually, I think first at a Halloween party in 1939. So we have strong Kalamazoo connections, and it's great to be back. Tonight, I would like to talk about a topic that I think is really important and should be of interest to museum goers, I think, everywhere. We all love museums, and many famous museums like the British Museum and the Louvre that I'll be talking about have their heritage out of private collections. And I just want to say that anything that I may say here is in no way meant to disparage museums. We cherish museums, but I think it's also important to be aware of the source of where the contents of the museums originate. And there have been many debates. I'm sure probably most of you are really familiar with a lot of it. And in fact, I'm going to start tonight with the one that is best known, the Parthenon. But the issues about what happens to art, and plundered art in particular, are very complex and more than just simply what's in a museum or what's not in a museum. As an archaeologist, I'm very concerned about preserving sites from illicit robbing, and particularly tombs from clandestini, for example, in Italy, and theft in general. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more toward the end of my talk. So what I plan to do is to first tell you, because there is one new drawing that I'm very eager to show you about what happened with the Parthenon. And then I want to discuss a little bit Cicero's contribution to the history of thinking about who owns art and where should art be, and is there a claim that can be made that art should be in a particular context? And then I'll look a little bit at what happened during the Napoleonic Wars, and then we'll jump forward more to the present day. So to start, I want to give you this fairly recent photograph of the Parthenon that is still under reconstruction. It's been going on for about 30 years. And what they're doing is they're dismantling parts of it and fixing it up so that it can be visited again without any danger. It was never really in danger of collapsing. But the problem is that in the 1930s, there was an engineer named Bolanos who used naked iron clamps to put the blocks back together. And in antiquity, the Greeks certainly knew that you had to surround any iron clamp with lead in order to make sure that the rusting iron wouldn't then crack the blocks. But Balanos did not do that. So the Parthenon was suffering during the 1930s and had been for some time from a lot of cracking and destruction. And so what they're doing now is using titanium so that they don't have to replicate the procedure of using iron clamps and liquid lead, but rather titanium clamps. And they're rebuilding and reconstructing certain parts of it. And I just want to say that Greek temples may look alike. Certainly freshmen in classes think that they look alike, but actually each part of each one is hand carved. They really are very individual. And in the case of a building like the Parthenon, we can know from measuring it usually pretty precisely where a block ought to be replaced. So all of this is pretty well documented. And in fact, that's what I was doing fairly recently on the temple in Sicily that Lynn mentioned to you, is that we were measuring and drawing blocks that were on the ground. And we've made a reconstruction of what the temple should look like based on that information. So these are handcrafted buildings, and they don't use cement. Rather, they're put together with clamps and dowels and in a particular pattern that allows us to make analogies and figure out how they should go back together. I also want to bring to your attention that originally the buildings were painted, especially in their upper parts. And here you see a well-known painting by Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, who actually based this painting on the frieze blocks from the Parthenon that Lord Elgin had taken down that were on exhibit so that Tadema could see them. And so therefore, this is really quite an accurate, at least the setting of the architecture is quite accurate archaeologically for the late 19th century. And what's more fanciful is that he's inserted, let's see, I think I can, yes, he's inserted Phidias here and Socrates with Alcibiades here and other famous Athenians who are standing on scaffolding looking up at this frieze. And I have to say that with my students, I've been able to go up even higher than that. And it's a very dizzying drop down to look at it from that particular vantage. But we have quite good documentation of the building and also computer reconstructions of the interior. And this is my favorite one because in the course of this reconstruction work that's been going on for the last 30 years or so, it's been discovered that there were actually windows in the Parthenon. And you see that here through the sunlight that is coming through the windows and reflecting off of a very shallow pool that was constructed in front of the great gold and ivory statue of Athena that was in the center of the temple. So this is actually quite a good reconstruction. I know it's a little bit fisheye and distorted, but that's to give you a sense of the width. And I highly recommend maybe the Art League could take you down to Nashville to see the Parthenon there, because that replica is actually quite accurate. It's very well done. They had on their committee William Bell Dinsmore, who at the time in the 1920s was a specialist in Greek architecture. And apart from engineering requirements and electricity and bathrooms and so on that were necessary to make it a functioning building, it's actually quite a reasonably accurate replica made out of cement, not Pentelic marble, but you still get an experience of the interior space. So this building, I think, really, when you get into the details of what makes it special, the fact that it had an octastyle facade with 8 columns as opposed to 6, which was the more normal at the time, and the way that this served to create an interior space that had almost like a ambulatory that would go around the image of Athena, make it a very, very special building that was done in the mid-5th century BC by an absolutely brilliant architect, Ictinus, whose name is on my current Michigan license plate, because the gods were all taken. So I thought that I would choose a godlike human. Now, here is the drawing that I'm very eager to show you. This has just been published once in 2013, a catalog of an exhibit that was put on in the British Museum, because it was very recently discovered, along with 799 other watercolors by Edward Dodwell that were found in a wooden case stuffed underneath a Scottish lord's bed. And it's a long, involved story, but my friend and colleague John Camp, who was then the director of the Agora, became friends with this man, and the man invited him. His last name is Gell, Lord Gell, and he turned out to be, I think, a great-great-grandnephew of Edward Dodwell, and so somehow these drawings had come down in his family. And what makes the drawings exceptional is that Edward Dodwell used a camera oscura, which was a very early form of a camera, but without film. It just uses a lens that in a dark box that projects an image upside down of whatever is being seen. And he would use that as the basis for his watercolors. So this is about as close to photography as you can get before there was photography. And by the way, all of those drawings were purchased by David Packard at John Camp's suggestion, because the Lord needed to have something to do with them. And so they've been on exhibit at the Getty and also the British Museum and also in Athens. And this is how we're now able to use the image. Well, what is being depicted here, we knew about it. So it isn't as though it's brand new, but it's just really shocking for those of us interested in this subject to see an actual image of it. You see Lord Elgin's agent here. Lord Elgin had been sent to Constantinople as a representative of the British government, but he participated in the enthusiasm for antiquities that was characteristic of his class and time in both England and also in France and Germany as well. And he convinced the then Sultan to give him a permit, a firman, as they called it in Turkish, to take away marbles from the Acropolis. But he stretched the definition of this to mean taking them down from actual buildings. And that's what's so shocking about this. He wasn't just picking up stray pieces that happened to be on the ground. Rather, he had a team up there on the frieze, and they were actually smashing the Geisen blocks. These are what in Latin, they're cornice blocks here, up above the Doric frieze. So the triglyphs you see here and carved metapiece. And I particularly want you to notice this one and the one being lowered on a rope here, because I'm going to show you the actual blocks in just a moment. But here you have Elgin's agent directing the business, the team up on the top here. And what you're seeing here is a Turkish mosque, an Ottoman mosque, that had been built in the center of the Parthenon at that point. And that's because the more elaborate version of the temple had been blown up by the Venetians in 1687. And although the Ottomans had turned what had been first a Greek temple, then a Christian church, and then a mosque, into essentially a ruin, as you see it here. But the Turks, who were still in charge of Athens at that point, until the Greek War of Independence in 1830, they built this smaller mosque right in the center of the Parthenon. And you also see the detail of this little shack over here, a ladder where they're up there taking more Geisen blocks down in order to get more metapiece. Anyway, it was quite an operation, but what this watercolor does is that it documents the destruction of the building in order to extract the sculpture. That's what makes this whole situation surrounding the Parthenon marbles different and distinct from other kinds of plundering in Greece, because it's not simply collecting up or digging out something that is just there, but rather it's actually destroying something that is still in place in order to extract parts that were considered of interest. Lord Elgin wanted these for his new house in Scotland. And what you see here are two slides that I took in the British Museum. And here you see what was represented on the frieze was a series of confrontations between a group of Greeks who were called Lapiths and the centaurs. And this was meant to be, we think, this is the usual art historical interpretation, is that it's meant to be a kind of a metaphorical reference to the fact that the Greeks had defeated the Persians, and the Persians were being equated with these rough centaurs who actually don't even have weapons to fight with. They fight with branches and with boulders in some representations. But the sculptor, and it was probably Phidias who designed all of this, made this so beautiful. When you look at these catenary curves in the cloak here, that is curves that are as though you were to take a chain and hang it up like that. They're absolutely beautiful here that are echoed. You see back and forth by the musculature here, these curves, very, very elegant. And then this more earlier form of combat here where you see he's just kicking the centaur. So just to go back for one sec, you see that representation up there, and here is the metopee that is being lowered. So what Elgin took was a whole set of metopees, most of the metopees, about more than half. He took quite a bit of the pedimental sculpture, and he also took more than half of the interior frieze that showed the Panathenaic procession that was held every year, and with a special pomp every 4 years to honor Athena and to bring her a carefully woven garment to be placed around a very old wooden image of Athena in a festival that was in effect based on the Olympic Games and the Olympic Festival, because there were musical contests, athletic contests, and so on, just like that one in Olympia. And so this was Athens' greatest celebration and greatest festival. And what was new and different about all of this is that humans and just ordinary Athenians were represented on the building for the first time, because usually the scenes on temples were like this one, where they're more in the mythological past, even though some people would like to see contemporary messages in them. Now, I want to add to all of this that at the time there was quite a bit of uproar about the idea of dismantling this, and there was an expat community, a resident in Athens, that included for a while Lord Byron. And as a gentleman, he actually wrote to Lord Elgin and warned him that he was going to write about this in his poetry. And there were other people. Dodwell in his publications excoriates Elgin for the depredation on the building. But by far the most famous, the one that really got read by lots of people, were these passages in Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And I've highlighted some of the phrases that I particularly like. The plunderers of yon fame here, that Scotland, Caledonia should blush that she would produce, that Scotland would produce this plunderer, that the bouldering shrines are removed, and finally, shrinking gods to northern climes abhorred. It's poetry that maybe doesn't appeal to the modern ear, except to specialists these days. But once you read some of it, it actually, you really have to admire the enormous skill and creative beauty that goes into this. But it's very clear that Lord Byron was vehemently opposed to the depredations that Lord Elgin took. And I just want to add that Lord Byron really, in effect, gave his life to Greece, because he then went on to participate in the Greek War of Independence. And he died in Missolonghi after several battles there with the Ottomans. So the Greeks were among the first European country to rise up, in this case against their Ottoman overlords who had ruled Greece for about 400 years, and throw off the Turkish yoke, as they call it, and establish themselves as an independent, coherent country. And it's really surprising to read that the idea of nationalism is really pretty young, because this is the time when it was really a hot topic. And it also bears on what I'm talking about today, because one of the expressions of nationalism was to create a big museum that would collect the world's antiquities and display how this nation now has absorbed the best from other nations that were there before. So there was quite a bit of controversy. And we have the documents from the meetings of the trustees of the British Museum. The British Museum, by the way, was founded back in 1759. So it was well underway by this time. And actually, Lord Elgin offered his sculpture for sale on the very eve of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And so the whole subject could not be taken up by Parliament until the following year. And there was quite a bit of debate about it in 1816. In the end, obviously, they decided to purchase it for the nation. And he was pretty angry that the price was so low. But in any case, that's where they are now. And many scholars have examined the details of all of this. And the basic conclusion is that from a legal standpoint, the British Museum does have the legal claim on this. So if the marbles were to be going back, it would simply because of a changed opinion and sentiment about what should happen to them. But the legal basis actually is this has been really thoroughly examined. It's pretty secure that they do have a legal claim on it, even though there has been a lot of question about this Turkish firman and so on. The legal aspect of this is pretty secure. So in thinking about this issue, keep in mind that it's more an evolution of opinion and of sentiment and of ethics about where things ought to be than it is a legal tussle in the particular case of the Parthenon. Now, from the point of view of the Greeks, Melina Mercury particularly started up a campaign when she became a government representative back in the 70s. And there is very strong sentiment that the sculpture ought to go back because there's still a living temple now to which it belongs. And in fact, when they put out the contract for their new Acropolis Museum, the plan that won was one that included a special room that you see here on the top of the museum that is twisted in a very sort of nice modernistic way to be exactly the parallel of the Parthenon itself up here on the Acropolis, so that you could stand at a window. You can do that today and look out and see the Parthenon from the top floor and then turn around and look at the sculpture. So there isn't any idea of putting the sculpture back on the building. That's not the issue. Rather, the issue is to display the sculpture in a way that you can look at both at the same time. And that's what they've done by constructing this new museum, which, by the way, is really quite beautiful and filled with other wonderful things too, and well worth visiting. I highly recommend it. And just to bring you up to date, the latest that I've heard, and mostly from a friend of mine when I was just in Athens the last 2 months, and the British Museum is in secret deals with the current Greek government. And the idea is to work out some kind of long-term loan without calling it a loan in Greece, but somehow calling it a loan technically in England. And in effect, there will be some sort of exchange, but the Greeks would not agree to a loan because they view it as their property. But the Brits, on the other hand, have to adhere to what is required by the British Museum, that this is property of the British Museum and of the British people. And so watch for that in newspaper articles and look carefully at how it's being described, because it looks as though they're on the brink of a deal and it's going to happen in the next couple of years. And in effect, it will be a return of these sculptures, but it will be couched in language that will be ambiguous. And I think that that'll be really interesting to watch. So I urge you to do that. Now, next, I want to tell you about the background to all of this. And we start with Cicero. I hope some of you read Cicero, maybe in a Latin class in high school or in university. He's absolutely a brilliant writer, was a brilliant orator and rhetorician, and mostly he was somebody who defended clients. But there was one famous case where he was a prosecutor. He made an exception to his usual pattern by being willing to take on the case of the Sicilians against Gaius Verres. And what had happened here is that Gaius Verres, who is very fully described in the set of speeches that we have preserved from Cicero, was appointed governor of Sicily. Now today, of course, Sicily is fully a part of Italy. It's all one country. But in antiquity, Greece had sent people to found new cities in Sicily as early as the 8th century BC. And so by the time that Rome was expanding out of the Italian peninsula, Greeks had been living in Sicily for more than 400 years, 600 years even, by the time that Sicily became a province of Rome. And all of that came about as a result of the Carthaginian Wars. And I won't go into that right here, but just to say that at the time in the 1st century BC that all of this happened, the island was considered completely Greek, but it was under the government and in the possession of Rome relatively recently. That had happened in 211 BC, so it had been, let's say, a little more than 100 years that Sicily had been a province of Rome. And the way that the Romans governed it was to send a magistrate who was actually second to the highest in rank to the consul, called a praetor, to basically run the island, collect the taxes, make sure everything was okay, make sure that any kind of judicial courts were running properly, and so on. And Sicily, like other Roman provinces elsewhere in Asia Minor and so on, and Greece itself, would suffer because there was a lot of scope for corruption and bribery here, and they kind of assumed that that would happen, and it wasn't anything that anybody really particularly did much about, although just to show you, there were extortion courts that had been established in Rome to address these issues. And one aspect of the Roman judiciary was that the Sicilians couldn't bring a case themselves. They had to get a Roman to bring the case. So they got Cicero, the best, in part because as a younger man, he was temporarily stationed in Sicily, and he had a whole chain of guest friends, as they call it in antiquity, around the island. And so he agreed to take this case. He went around the island and quickly collected up a lot of written documentation, documenting the corruption of Verres. And in order to make this case interesting and important to his audience in the Roman Forum, what he did was to magnify and emphasize the fact that Verres was taking religious art. And this is the key point. What is this art? Today we have stuff that people make that has no connection with anything spiritual necessarily. But in antiquity, everything, even dishes would have images of deities on them. Everything was considered connected as part of something that would be offered to a deity. And certainly statuary was always connected in some way to a religious aspect, either as a cult image or as a dedication within a sanctuary. So what we need to take away is our post-Renaissance view of art as just a kind of a commodity that sometimes can be spiritual, and think back to the way it was before the Renaissance, when everything visual had a spiritual connection, especially in antiquity. And so Cicero really emphasized that point, making it seem as though if you jurors don't find him guilty, in effect, you'll be participating in this larger disrespect of the Roman gods. And the Romans also respected the Greek gods as well, very much so, especially Demeter. So he did this very effectively, so much so that Verres went off with his shiploads of loot off and took refuge in the city of Marseille, which at the time was also very much a Greek city. And there's actually a Stephen Saylor murder mystery that's set there that portrays Verres quite nicely, if you would like to read a fictional account of what happened afterward. And I just want to say that Cicero took the opportunity of these events to publish all of his research in the form of 4 lectures, 4 orations that he gave. The first one he actually delivered, and that's what drove Verres into exile. But he wanted to make sure that people knew what had happened, so he published the other 3 orations as though he had actually given them in the forum. These are all preserved. In fact, they became school texts. I found examples that were preserved in Egypt just maybe 20, 30 years after they had been published, in which they were school texts with Greek translations interlinearly, because in Alexandria, people were learning Latin, but they started out as Greek speakers. So these texts have been very well preserved, and you can read them today. And what Cicero does is to enumerate how this Roman governor went around the island, looting art, looting private possessions, cheating people out of their inheritances, manipulating contracts. And Cicero will even rhetorically ask, what is he going to do with 30 bronze beds anyway? And it's very, very entertaining reading. It's just absolutely gripping. And this is why I decided to work on this, because I was reading these texts and became very engaged in them. Well, because they are so brilliantly written, they've had a huge impact up to this day. Not on people restraining themselves from taking things, though. So I want to emphasize that the idea that to the victor goes the spoils, or as my nephew said, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, that still was in effect. And here's an example from Rome where Augustus took an obelisk from Egypt, which he had obtained as his own private province after defeating Antony and Cleopatra. And he used this obelisk as the gnomon, or pointer, for a giant sundial that was underneath this piazza where you see it displayed here. However, at a certain point in Roman history, really by about the time of Hadrian, around 115 or so, Romans were making art of their own. They didn't really need to plunder it from other people. So it really, you see this fluctuation up and down about plundering art and so on. But overall, I have to hand it to the Romans that although they took a lot of things from Greece, they also contributed a lot and built buildings and sanctuaries, Hadrian in particular. So overall, we can't really find the Romans too culpable. Well, then we flash forward to early modern times, and I just want to trace the impact of some of these ideas about who should own art. Does art have a particular context? What Cicero had said was that the people that we Romans conquer will come to the forum and see the images from their hometown, and they'll weep. And this is not to our advantage. We can govern them much more easily if we allow them to keep their special religious statutes. Well, as you know, during the Grand Tour, starting in the 18th century, more or less, there was the whole sense of a continuation of the Renaissance, where essentially well-to-do people, both men and women, would venture down into Italy, largely because Greece was still closed off and still under the Ottoman Empire. And they were able to buy up quite a bit from the then flourishing Roman art market, despite the fact that the then popes and other individuals tried to keep a stop to this. There was quite a movement of ancient art of all sorts that moved north up to France and up to Germany and especially up to England. And I just show you here the famous statue of the Discobolus that was part of the Townley collection. And you see here the intellectual aspect of this with these gentlemen sitting in the study here, the three of them discussing, or rather four of them discussing the items and eagerly seeking them out, the whole antiquarian movement that preceded true archaeology, because they really were interested in enumerating and cataloging and discussing it with themselves. And this collection became part of the core of the antiquities collection of the British Museum, although there is also a Townley Museum that has some of the items. And I want to say that Americans participated in this too. Here's Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Izard from South Carolina, Charleston, who met John Singleton Copley in Rome and commissioned him to paint themselves here with some very elaborate furniture. And in the background, you see a statue group that we still have today, and also a red-figured vessel up here that we still have. The Colosseum in the background, just so that everybody would know that this is in Rome here. And really look at their faces. It's quite wonderful. These are people that you could know. It's really a wonderful depiction of a particular moment in history when there was keen appreciation of antiquity. That continued on with the French Revolutions and its successor movements that thought that really art ought to be released from royal collections and brought to Paris so that all Frenchmen could enjoy it. And Napoleon built on this and followed the precedent that had been set before he actually came to absolute power. And so for more than a decade, as he made his way up and down Europe, he accumulated vast amounts of art, including Raphael's Transfiguration, enormous canvases that had to be cut in half in order to be moved to Paris. And all of this was to be for what today we call the Louvre, but get this, he was naming it after himself, the Musée Napoleon. So yes, very much a narcissist, shall we say. And once again, there was also there were French voices who were very much against them. And this man in particular, Catemer de Concy, who was a kind of an armchair archaeologist and also a historian and an art critic, who had avidly read Cicero's Verines, and also Polybius, who articulated some of the ideas before Cicero. And he got together a whole petition of artists and authors to sign and declare themselves opposed to this idea of gathering up art from all over Europe and putting it in one location. To no avail, though. I mean, Napoleon just went right ahead and did what he wanted to do. And I just wanted to show you two of the major objects that temporarily were in Paris because of Napoleon. One of them is this famous statue of the priest Laocoon, the priest of Apollo at Troy, who had predicted the fall of Troy if the wooden horse would be brought in. And then two serpents came out of the sea according to Virgil's Aeneid, and embrace the children and Laocoon himself. And so in this magnificent sculpture group, you see the priest struggling with the serpents and his two young sons trying not to be engulfed by them, because evidently Poseidon didn't want Laocoon to give away what was about to happen. So that's why he suffered this way. And when it was discovered, in the time of Michelangelo, it was greatly admired and came to be regarded at that time as the foremost sculpture. And I think you could see some Michelangelo-esque aspects here, because he took Laocoon's body as a model for some of his own sculpture. Another major group that was taken by Napoleon were the gilded bronze horses of San Marco in Venice. Now, the Venetians had taken these from Constantinople in 1205, and Constantine had taken them from some sanctuary in Greece, probably Delphi, way back, his agents, that is, way back around 330 when he was building up. So the horses traveled from Greece to Byzantium, and then from what was then Constantinople to Venice, and then to Paris. And actually some British newspapers around this time wrote some very funny poetry, as though it were in the first person of the horses, in which the horses coyly say that they don't mind traveling around, but they really want to go home, and they like Venice best of all. And so this was, of course, the symbol of Venice since 1205, and they were very distraught that Napoleon would take them off. We have this engraving that shows a Roman-style triumphal procession. That is, Napoleon deliberately modeled his depredations on those of ancient Rome, where you see the horses on a cart here and other items being brought in procession here as a kind of a triumphal parade of plundered art that would now go into the French Museum. And in addition, we have a porcelain vessel, actually two of them. So you see the overall view here, and here is a detail of the Laocoon being taken in that triumphal procession that you see here to celebrate all of this. Well, in 1815, when the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, the big question of the day was then, once Napoleon was fully captured and shipped off to St. Helena, because he could not be trusted on a more nearby island. They knew that since he had escaped from Elba. The big question was what was going to happen to all of this. The Duke was very, very busy, but we have correspondence, and I was actually able to read it in the Duke's archives, which are in Southampton in the UK, and hold the famous letters in my ungloved hands, which was really amazing. They prefer you not to use gloves these days, because in the old days they wanted you to wear gloves because the oils on your fingers might stain the paper. But nowadays it's just your hands are touching what the Duke touched. So it was fantastic. Now, I'm not convinced that he actually read Cicero's Verines, but he was an 18th century gentleman who was very well read. We know he read Latin because he talked about how useful Julius Caesar's Gallic War was to him in the Peninsular campaigns. And we also have book lists of what he took with him to India when he was just starting out. And he certainly would have read Plutarch's Life of Marcellus and Plutarch's Life of Cicero, which have some comments about the trial of Verres in it. But I think he was simply acting on the ethics that these items belong where they were, not to be kept as the French, as trophies of this war, which they were now defeated in. So he made the decision in conjunction with members of the British government but notice that this is a decision that he's making as a general. So it's by force, not by law. This is by force that he has the authority and the position to say all of these things ought to be returned. So here you see a painting document the jubilant return of the 4 horses back to San Marco and Venice here, so they're being taken. And in general, there's been a lot of scholarship on this about what has gone back and what has not gone back. I would say just generally it's about 51% was returned back to the previous owners. So in other words, the Louvre still has. And what Denon, the curator of the Louvre, very cleverly did was to ship a lot of these items out to provincial museums in France. So they're actually all over France, not just centrally in the Louvre. But about 49% of what Napoleon looted is still there, including some columns from Aachen and all kinds of things. So this was the outcome of that particular interlude. But people didn't forget about Cicero, and I just wanted to show you this one representation that I found of the trial of Verres, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, done by Eugene Delacroix. And it shows a kind of an imaginary view of Cicero declaiming at the trial of Verres. So people continued to read these things, and it also had an impact on the early formulation of international law, especially by Hugo Grotius. But the person that I want to point out to you now as I wind this up is Francis Lieber, who was a Prussian who fought actually as a teenager at Waterloo. And then he emigrated to the United States, and he was an absolutely brilliant man who edited the first Encyclopedia Americana. And he eventually became a professor in South Carolina, and Abraham Lincoln asked him to write up these general orders for how Union soldiers should behave. And for the first time in a legal document, it was put down that soldiers on the battlefield ought to respect what today we would call cultural property. So that included museums, schools, any scientific collections, any scientific instruments, anything of historical value, monuments, sculptures. And so all of that, soldiers were ordered to respect on the battlefield. And that was the first time that this concept of cultural property was actually inserted into something that became a legal force. And in fact, even today, soldiers do carry a little card that has battle rules of engagement that has a kind of a very distant descendant of that General Orders number 100. And that also the Europeans, especially in the later 19th century, admired Lieber's writing. And this became the basis for the subsequent Hague Conventions that specifically recognized cultural property as something that ought to be protected in time of war. However, as you know, and again, we're flashing forward to the future, during World War II, this was not respected at all by the Nazis. And so here we return to the Louvre again, and here you see the empty frames that were created when they, in anticipation of the invasion, they had to put away they hid them in order to get them out of the way of the Nazis. Now, this wasn't entirely successful, but it did manage to save and preserve quite a bit. But as you know, there were monuments men, both an American group and a British group, and they documented a lot of what was found in Germany. And I think that this one photograph really says quite a bit. You see the American soldier standing here, and towering over him are stacks and stacks of paintings that were stored up here by the Nazis. A photo taken in 1945. So that represents something that's beyond any ethics, beyond any morals. It's still unfolding with many, many claims, especially those of Jewish families, who know about paintings that are specifically in museums or in private hands. This is an ongoing issue, the repercussion, and it really has very little to do with Cicero, except that we, the rest of the world who are not Nazi participants, know about how cultural property ought to be treated, and we're shocked by this. So there's another line of thinking here that's more archaeological that I just want to address briefly, and that is the whole problem of stolen art through the efforts of looters. And the most famous vessel is this one. Originally, this was made by a Greek painter named Euphronius, who was so proud of this that he signed his name on it. And it shows Sarpedon, who has been mortally wounded here, being taken off by two winged figures, and their names are given. Sleep and Death are carrying off Sarpedon, and they're going to take him back to his parents. And Hermes is standing there overlooking the scene. So this is meant to evoke the Trojan War and all the stories connected with this Trojan War. It's a masterpiece. The way that the vessel would have been used was at a men's drinking party. They did not admire drunkenness. And so what they did is to water down their wine. And the purpose of this vessel is, it's called a crater, which means a mixing bowl. And you were meant to water down your wine. And there would always be discussion, as there is today, about martinis. What is the proportion going to be? Is it going to be 1-2, 1-13, whatever? So, but that's what the purpose of this vessel was. And it was buried with some well-off Etruscan person near Cerveteri in Italy, discovered, broken into pieces, put on the art market. It was purchased by Dietrich von Bottmer of the Metropolitan Museum with the connivance of Thomas Hoving, who talks about this in his book called Making the Mummies Dance. And he says, quite bluntly, we were pirates back then. And they paid $1 million for it, which at the time was huge. And apparently the clandestini went wild. And that shifted this whole aspect of looting things from just being something casual that farmers would do on a Saturday night with a bottle of Chianti and a pickaxe. Now it's a big business, and it still is today. And the person who was the intermediary was caught because he loved to take photographs of himself next to the exhibition. And he also kept a meticulous record of his activities in Geneva. So all of this was documented, and he has been thoroughly convicted. And I just want to say it's not just the evil dealers, but there are also the buyers and the curators. And in some museums, this is still going on today. And there are also people who are trying to amass private collections of antiquities. Yet, from a legal point of view, anything that was acquired after 1970 is suspect. You could talk about buying it from an old collection or whatever, but it's suspect if it's bought after 1970. The days of collecting antiquities are over, or they should be over. But in the case of a New York couple, Leon Levy and Shelby White, they amassed quite a collection in the 2000s, which is gradually being dismantled as more claims are made. And it was actually a Greek student of sculpture, a very distinguished historian of ancient Greek sculpture, Georg Thespines, who noticed that he saw these two things independently. He knew this bottom part here, and then this upper right part appeared in a catalog photograph, because the way that Leon Levy and Shelby White laundered their collection would be to exhibit it at the Metropolitan Museum in New York with a catalog, and then it would be considered published, and then people would start talking about it. And Yorgos Thespines was so good with his eye, because he had actually worked in a quarry as a young man, that he realized that those two must go together. So the Greek government demanded it back, and sure enough, you could see how it was hacked apart here. That's not normal breakage. That's probably deliberate so that they could sell off this upper part and then, okay, so there's the bottom part. But together, it's much more interesting, don't you think? And so this is how it's displayed now in the museum at Brow Run, which is closest to Porto Rafti, which is where it was found. So today, I would say the hot spot for antiquity seems to be, once again, Mesopotamia. And I'm going to show you next a stele, just to show you that, again, as with Greek and Roman things that I've been talking about, this idea of to the victor goes the spoils is one that really is pretty universal in antiquity. And we're going to look at an Akkadian stele, probably from the city of Sippur, but we don't really quite know where it was because it was eventually found in French excavations at Susa in this area called Elam near the Zagros Mountains. So this is actually modern day Iran as opposed to modern day Iraq over on this side. And so the French have this in the Louvre. And what it is this, it's called the Stele of Naram Sin. And what you see is Naram Sin shown larger than life and with a horned helmet going up a mountain and probably in consultation with two astral deities over here. And you see some defeated people falling down and his troops following him. But notice that on this mountain, there's an inscription. And here you see a detail of the inscription in cuneiform. And the inscription is actually Elamite. And it turns out that Naram Sin put up this stele to celebrate his victory over the Lulubi back around 2230. But then almost 1,000 years later, people from Elam took that stele off to what the town we call Susa. So this itself, although it was a trophy, it was an antique trophy by 1158, and the people of Elam took it off and inscribed their own victory on top of it in cuneiform there. So I just want to say that this idea of to the victor go the spoils is very, very ancient indeed. But then flashing forward, unfortunately, one of the terrible things that happened, one among many, during the US invasion of Iraq is that the American forces stationed there turned a blind eye to the looting of the Baghdad Museum. And this is detailed in a book by Bogdanos called Thieves of Baghdad, in great detail, all of the evidence of that. I think he had served as a Marine at that time and got interested in all of these issues. And so what's particularly awful about this is that it wasn't just ordinary plundering of a museum, but the best pieces were taken and still have not yet been returned. And so it's thought that it's almost as though some wealthy collector submitted a shopping list of what he wanted that they would take from the museum. And you could see the damage that was caused to the shelves here, and the sculpture was toppled over, and it really is pretty horrific. And one result of that is that we've lost about 10,000 cuneiform tablets, most of them never recorded, not yet transcribed. The number of people who can read cuneiform is pretty small, but still, there were so many of them that we don't even know what they said, and yet they're missing. Many of them were purchased by the Green family, the owners of Hobby Lobby, for their Bible museum. And some of those have been returned. They also purchased a lot of papyri from a suspect person, and some of that has been returned either. But I just want to point out that this is very much an ongoing issue. So a few years later, after the main part of the American invasion, looting was done out in the open. Now, Saddam Hussein, for all of his negative aspects, had not allowed this. He was very proud of the Mesopotamian past, and looting was punishable by death under Saddam Hussein. But once he was gone and out of the office, nobody was really paying attention. So here you see an ancient site that's been completely looted. Okay, that's 2008. Well, when I was in Athens a few weeks ago, I think it was April 21st is when this story came out, it's still going on. And I thought I would collect these images to show you for this talk, that they had a whole article about what was happening at the site of Palmyra and another ancient site called Apamea that is in Syria. And so here you see in broad daylight a looter going to work. And finally, I end with this. Here you see, again, April 2025. These are the looting pits. And this is a late Roman site that flourished from the Hellenistic period onward. And we're losing chapters of history this way. So I wanted to bring these issues to your attention so that you could think about the origin. Now here, I think in this museum we're safe, that we know who the artists are, and it was all purpose created. But when you go, for example, to the Detroit Institute of Arts or other museums that have antiquities collections, be sure to read the label and see, where did this come from and when was it acquired? And was it since 1970? Probably not. Anyway, thank you for listening.
So, questions?
Yeah.
We will take a few questions. Anybody have questions for Dr. Miles? Sir.
The 1970 date. What was
Yeah.
significant about that?
That was a UNESCO agreement that there would no longer be any sale of antiquities. Now, in addition, individual countries have their own dates. For example, Italy's date, I think, is 1936. So there are earlier dates for individual countries, but this was a UNESCO agreement of 1970. And as far as publication of scholarly articles about antiquities, the cutoff date was 1973, when the American Journal of Archaeology and other scholarly journals have announced in 1973 that they would not publish any articles that were about items like that stele, that were of the grave stele that I showed, that were of suspect provenance. That's why having it published in a catalog was a kind of a sneaky maneuver around that clause. But anyway, the 1970 date is a UNESCO agreement.
Do we have time for one more question? Any more? Ma'am.
So are individuals that might have this art, are they contributing them back?
You
So
mean,
if a rich person bought a piece of this antiquity art, are many people returning them to the original
Well,
countries?
Shelby White is. She's now a widow, and she is trying to make amends, I think. So she sent back this grave stele. I think she still has half of a bronze statue from Turkey, the other half of which is in Turkey, as far as I know. But she also sought to make amends by setting up a research institute in New York City to study antiquity. So some people are trying to make amends. But in general, what I've encountered I haven't met very many of them, but I know of them from friends of mine who have more dealings with them, that they're interested in just owning things. For example, I was taken to the house of a collector in Laguna Beach. And this, by the way, wasn't my idea. So I just want to say that. I was so offended. This guy had a Roman mosaic hanging over the guest bathroom's toilet, so that, while he's using the toilet, he can look at this Roman mosaic, clearly cut out of context. And he had a Corinthian capital that he was using as a coffee table. And then he had a whole collection of pots. That was the friend that I went there with is a specialist in pottery, and he was willing to look at this stuff to see what it was. And the quid pro quo is to tell them what they have. And frankly, I really disapprove of that. But anyway, there is an attitude, it's almost like a sickness, and Varys is the best example of someone who just wants to own these things. It's ownership, that possession. So some give them back, others are very happy to hang on to them, and quite a lot that we know existed has disappeared. I mean, there are all kinds of unsolved robberies of museums, like the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, that it's unsolved because whoever has those stolen paintings still has them. And the Edvard Munch paintings, I know there are several of them in a series, they've been stolen multiple times. And also there are crazies who want to destroy. Look at the person who came in with a sledgehammer to hammer the Pietà and St. Peter's Basilica. It's now behind plexiglass. And also there's a huge archaic crater called the Francois vase that's just amazing, early 6th century. And somebody came with a hammer into Florence and smashed that. At least they could put it back together again. But there's something about certain pieces of art that just seem to trigger a kind of a madness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.